Well, the wife is gone for a few hours this evening. She's up at play practice because she's the prop manager for the local theater. So it gives me a couple hours and I'm going to now go back to work on my caustic project. And this is what I've done. I've built this jig, as you can see, with my three main frames in place. I've glued my keel on, and I produced this jig like this. See? Okay, now this thing is quite sturdy. You know, it's not going to bend or break on me. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start putting in some of those frames I built. I could take epoxy and put it in each one of these notches down here on the keel, and in each one of these notches on the jig. Then take my frames and just go right down the line and drop them in. See how fast that's going? Just like that. But there's some problems when you do it this way. So I'm not going to do that. See? That's how quick you can put your frames in. But let me show you something up close. Even though all these frames were built on that jig, like we did in the first part of this series, when we just drop them in the jig, notice this. We're taking this last frame I dropped in. Okay, see on this side? It's nice and flush with the top of the jig. But when you go on this side, see, it's above the surface of the jig, which means this last frame, number 6 in here, is cocked in there a little bit. And as we go down the line, notice this one's high, that one's low, that one's low. Same thing on this side, we have highs and lows. And also, when we look down on it, see that? The frame is not hitting the edge of the jig. So what we have to do is use a clamp, and we have to push it over just like that. So rather than just taking all of these and dropping them in there, which is a very quick way to do it, but it's not that accurate. Okay, here's how I put in my frames. I'm going to put a little bit of epoxy down here on my keel notch. Then I'm going to slip in my frame. I didn't put any glue, any epoxy here on these notches, because when you slide this down, all it's going to do is grab that epoxy and smear it all down the side of the frame. So I'm going to put that in first. Next, I'm going to put a clamp right over this notch and clamp it down to make sure that frame seats. I didn't tighten it, I just snugged it on there. Now, I'm going to take my epoxy and I'm going to bend this frame inward and fill this notch full of epoxy. Like that. Let it snap back. Same thing on this side. I want to push that frame in, fill this full of epoxy, like that. And now I want to take these clamps and I want to clamp the top of this frame in. Make sure the frame is level with the jig top. Same thing on this side. Make sure it's level and then clamp it. Now the last thing I want to do is take these heavier clamps and I want to bring them down here on these floor timbers and just snug them up in case there's any warpage. So that floor timber number 13 lines up with floor timber number 12. Okay, now let's slip it in here. Alright. and snug it up. There we go. Snug this one up. Okay, now I can go back and tighten this a little bit more. Recheck my frame tops, and they are nicely lined up with the jig. So I'm going to let that sit up. Okay, the reason why I'm putting these frames in one at a time and using these clamps here and here to level out these floor timbers is because I learned my lesson on this haul. Now notice here, let me get in there, the difference between this frame and this frame up here, and then the next frame over. Go on to this side and look at, there's very little difference between these two frames and this one. So what's happening is either this frame or this frame is in there crooked, and that makes it very difficult to sand this hull nice and even. So let's look again. You see this difference here. So we were trying to keep these things exactly the same distance apart on both sides of the hull. You can see how much wider this is between here and here compared to here and here. So that is why one frame at a time, and making sure everything is lined up. The floors are even, it seats down into a notch, and the top of the frames are nice and level with the jig. It is very tempting to just go right down this hull and drop all these frames in, but this is really my setup. You see these two clamps right here, they're holding that frame tight in that notch on both sides. Okay, and down here the center one's holding it into the notch, and the two end ones are holding the two floor timbers from frame 12 and frame 13 pretty level. So when you look underneath, see, that's kind of the setup I have going. Alright, so let's just pan around and take a look. And see, this whole jig is sitting on blocks, so it is up off the ground. So I could go ahead and use clamps underneath of it. Okay, so now I have to set, and I'm using 5-minute epoxy, so I'll let it set up for about 5 minutes, then move on to my next frame. Okay, that's it.